On the morning of June 7th, 1944, just one day after the largest seaborne invasion in history, the beaches of Normandy were no longer just a battlefield. They had become a graveyard of twisted steel, shattered hopes, and broken bodies. The clash of armies still rumbled in the distance, but here, amid the dunes and hedgerows, something remarkable was unfolding. German soldiers, many of them barely more than boys, lay wounded in makeshift field hospitals, their faces pale, their breaths shallow, and standing over them were not their own doctors, but American medics, tired, mud-stained, their hands trembling from exhaustion, bending down to save the lives of men who hours earlier had been trying to kill them. For the German doctors and orderlies taken prisoner alongside their wounded, the sight was staggering. War had taught them that mercy was a luxury, that the enemy was less than human. Yet here they were, witnessing something that defied the brutal logic of the battlefield. American medics treating German soldiers before they even looked after their own. It was a quiet revolution, carried out not with rifles and tanks, but with bandages, morphine, and compassion. This moment, easily lost in the thunder of World War II's great battles, reveals something essential about the conflict. That even in the darkest hours of human cruelty, there were glimmers of humanity so powerful, they left hardened men speechless. The story of how German doctors watched in disbelief as American medics rushed to care for their enemies first is not just an anecdote of war. It is a reminder of the values that separate conquest from civilization, cruelty from compassion, and hatred from the fragile possibility of peace. The night after D-Day had been long and merciless. The storm of war that had descended upon Normandy on June 6, 1944, left not only the beaches littered with wreckage, but the countryside behind them soaked in blood. All through the night, American field hospitals struggled to cope with the endless tide of casualties. The sounds were haunting: groans, screams, whispered prayers, the rasp of soldiers whose lungs were filling with blood. Lanterns swayed in the coastal winds as weary medics worked hour after hour, their boots slick with mud and crimson pools that mixed with the earth. Exhaustion clung to every man in uniform, yet the wounded kept coming, carried on stretchers, dragged by comrades, or hobbling in under their own strength. There was no pause, no moment of silence. The war demanded everything, and yet, in the middle of this storm, a decision was made that would astonish both friend and foe. Among those brought in were German prisoners, soldiers of the Wehrmacht captured in the first violent hours of the invasion. Many were scarcely older than the American teenagers who faced them. Some had shrapnel embedded in their bodies, others suffered burns from exploding shells, and more than one was riddled with bullet wounds that left them barely clinging to life. They were placed on stretchers beside Americans equally broken by the fighting. To the German orderlies and doctors taken prisoner alongside them, the expectation was clear: the Americans would surely tend to their own first. That was the logic of war. That was how things had been done on the Eastern Front, where German medics themselves often looked upon Soviet prisoners as expendable. But here, on the edge of a French field dotted with wildflowers trampled underfoot, something entirely different unfolded. The American medics, led by officers hardened by years of training in the principles of the Geneva Convention and the ethical codes of their profession, began treating the most gravely wounded first, without asking whether the uniform on the stretcher was olive drab or field grey. A German soldier whose leg was nearly severed by a mortar blast was rushed into surgery before an American private with a less threatening arm wound. Morphine was administered to a German corporal, writhing in agony, even as American soldiers nearby clenched their teeth and endured their pain in silence. To the German medical staff watching under guard, it was a revelation. The very men they had been taught were ruthless conquerors, merciless in their drive to annihilate, were showing a discipline of compassion that overturned every expectation. This was not kindness born of softness. The American medics were not strangers to blood, nor were they untouched by hatred for an enemy that had slaughtered their brothers on beaches and in towns across Europe. Many had seen their comrades gunned down, their friends' bodies left lifeless in the surf of Omaha and Utah. They carried grief in their eyes and vengeance in their hearts. Yet when confronted with the wounded, something deeper prevailed. For them, the act of healing transcended nationality. They were soldiers, yes, but also guardians of a moral code that insisted the value of human life did not end at the edge of a battlefield. The German doctors, themselves captives now, tried to process what they saw. They whispered among each other in disbelief. One later recalled that in Germany, had the situation been reversed, their men would have been left to die until every German had been saved first. On the Eastern Front, Soviet prisoners often received nothing at all, no bandage, no drop of water, no chance at survival. Here, however, in this patch of French countryside, they witnessed what seemed unthinkable, their enemies moving with urgency, sweat running down their brows, working feverishly to preserve the lives of Germans. The sight etched itself into their memories with a force more lasting than the boom of artillery. For the American medics, it was not only duty, but also pragmatism. They knew that by saving the lives of enemy soldiers, they demonstrated a principle that went beyond the war itself. They were showing the world, and perhaps even their prisoners, that the United States fought not only for victory, but for ideals that made victory meaningful. This was the battle for hearts as much as for land. Compassion in the field hospital was a weapon of its own kind, cutting through hatred in ways bullets never could. As dawn broke on June 7th, the first rays of sun revealed the haggard faces of men who had not slept for 2 days. Some medics slumped against their makeshift tables, closing their eyes for seconds at a time before rising again to stitch wounds or change bandages. German and American soldiers lay side by side, the moans of the wounded blending into a chorus that transcended language. For a brief moment, there was no war in that tent, only men caught in the same fragile struggle for survival. The days following D-Day unfolded like a fever dream, a relentless cycle of combat, chaos, and compassion. The field hospitals became sanctuaries where the boundaries between enemy and ally blurred into insignificance. The work of the medics grew heavier as more prisoners were brought in. Columns of German soldiers surrendering, some wounded, others uninjured but shaken. Many of the injured Germans arrived carried by their own comrades who, under armed escort, handed them over to the very men they had been ordered to kill. The look in their eyes betrayed confusion, fear, and sometimes a silent plea for mercy. When they saw American medics crouch down and immediately begin to treat their wounded first, the disbelief deepened. Even the guards, hardened infantrymen, occasionally muttered in frustration, "Why are we wasting supplies on them when our boys are lying there too?" Yet the medics continued their work undeterred, guided not by vengeance, but by principle. Inside those canvas tents, humanity clashed with the brutal reality of war. The Americans had limited supplies. Morphine, plasma, bandages, and surgical instruments ran dangerously low. Every choice mattered. Every vial of plasma could mean the difference between life and death. It would have been easy, even justifiable, to ration supplies exclusively to their own men. But still, medics knelt beside Germans and administered plasma drips. Still, they carried German stretchers toward the operating tables, and still they injected morphine into arms, clad in field grey. For the German doctors standing under guard, watching helplessly, it was a sight that tore apart everything they thought they understood. The Americans were not only capable of cruelty, they chose mercy even when it was costly. One captured German medic later admitted that at first he believed this was a trick, a performance meant to demoralize them. But as the days stretched on, as he saw the same care repeated over and over, his disbelief gave way to a reluctant respect. The field hospitals became microcosms of war's contradictions. On one cot, an American paratrooper clutched the hand of a German conscript who was coughing blood. Neither spoke the other's language. Yet in that shared grasp was a recognition that both were victims of decisions made far above their heads. In another corner, an American medic bent over a young German soldier whose face was mangled by shrapnel. He whispered encouragement in English that the boy could not understand, but the tone carried more than the words. These moments, fleeting and fragile, revealed that beneath the uniforms and national flags, all men bled the same color and feared the same death, and still, outside the hospital tents, the war raged with unrelenting fury. The countryside echoed with the roar of artillery, the rattle of machine guns, the cries of civilians caught in the crossfire. At night, when the medics stepped outside to catch a breath, they could see the distant glow of burning villages on the horizon. The sky lit orange and black. The contrast was surreal. Inside the tent, men worked tirelessly to save lives, while just beyond the canvas walls, men were tearing them apart. The German doctors could not ignore the irony. Their own medical services had long been subordinated to a war machine that regarded enemy lives as expendable. They recalled the orders from their superiors in Russia, where captured soldiers were often left untreated, abandoned to die in snow and mud. To see their captors act differently forced them to confront the uncomfortable truth that perhaps their system, their ideology, had stripped them of something essential. Some American medics confessed to their journals that treating enemy soldiers was one of the hardest trials of their service. They had lost brothers, friends, men they had trained with for months to German bullets and shells. The temptation for revenge burned hot. And yet, when confronted with the sight of a young German boy, barely 18, writhing in pain, the desire for vengeance softened. Duty, medical, moral, and human, triumphed over bitterness. The Germans noticed this struggle. They saw the Americans grit their teeth, swallow their anger, and continue their work. This was not weakness. It was strength of another kind, one that carried an invisible weight. The scene did more than save German lives. It reshaped minds. Some German soldiers, lying in those cots and realizing that their lives had been spared by their enemies, began to question the propaganda they had grown up with. The Reich had painted Americans as monsters, soulless, greedy, ruthless. Yet here they were, bleeding their energy dry to save Germans who might never even thank them. Many of those wounded Germans later recalled that the first seeds of doubt about the Nazi worldview were planted not by Allied bombs or speeches, but by the quiet determination of an American medic leaning over them with a bandage and a steady hand. At times, American and German doctors exchanged glances heavy with unspoken meaning. The prisoners wanted to help, wanted to reach for the surgical instruments and join in, but they were bound by their status as captives. Some Americans allowed small acts, passing instruments, preparing bandages, or translating for their wounded comrades. These moments of collaboration were brief but profound. Men who had stood on opposite sides of machine gun nests just hours before now stood shoulder to shoulder over an operating table, saving lives instead of taking them. In these stolen moments of cooperation, the thin veil of enmity was torn aside, and what remained was the shared oath of healers. Even so, resentment simmered in the ranks outside. Some American soldiers grumbled bitterly that the medics were wasting time and resources on Krauts, while their own men suffered. Others spat in the direction of the tents, unable to comprehend why compassion was being extended to those they saw as murderers. But the medics remained resolute. They were not soldiers of vengeance. They were guardians of a code older than the war itself, one that insisted humanity could not be abandoned even in the depths of hell. And though the debate raged, though anger flared, the work continued. For every life saved, whether American or German, the medics proved that mercy could exist even where hatred burned fiercest. As the days turned into weeks after the Normandy landings, the memory of those first shocking encounters in the field hospitals did not fade. It deepened. The German doctors who had been captured found themselves replaying the scenes in their minds again and again. The sight of enemy medics bending over their men, the sound of steady voices calming frightened soldiers, the astonishing reality that men sworn to oppose them had chosen to preserve their lives instead of extinguish them. These images clung to them, even as they were marched away from the beaches, guarded by American infantry and carried further into captivity. For some, the dissonance was unbearable. They had spent years under a regime that told them mercy was weakness, that compassion was a flaw, and that strength meant crushing enemies without hesitation. To witness the opposite not as propaganda, but with their own eyes, planted seeds of doubt that no speech could erase. The Americans, too, were changed by what had transpired. Many medics later confessed in letters and memoirs that treating enemy wounded was among the hardest duties they ever performed. War strips away the simple categories of good and evil, and here in the muddy wards of Normandy, that complexity became undeniable. A medic might spend 1 hour desperately trying to save a German soldier whose chest had been ripped open by shrapnel, and then step outside the tent to hear that another American unit had just been ambushed by Germans a few miles away. The paradox was crushing. Saving men who might have killed your brothers while others of their comrades continued to kill without mercy. And yet for many, the act of choosing compassion became a way of reclaiming their own humanity in a war that constantly threatened to devour it. The captured German doctors found themselves speaking softly with their American counterparts in stolen moments, exchanging nods, sometimes sharing fragments of their own medical knowledge. In those conversations, often brief, always guarded, they glimpsed the truth that the language of healing was universal. One American medic later remembered a captured German surgeon quietly advising him during a surgery, pointing with his eyes toward a severed artery he had missed. In that moment, the war receded, and only 2 doctors remained, bound not by politics or flags, but by the urgency of saving a life. The guards who watched this happen often frowned, unable to reconcile the sight of enemies cooperating with their own visions of the war. But for the men who held the scalpel or the bandage, the instinct to heal ran deeper than the instinct to divide. The wounded Germans themselves carried these memories far beyond the war. Many who survived captivity would recall that their first experience of kindness after surrender was not from their own comrades, but from American medics who spared neither time nor supplies to treat them. Decades later, at reunions or in interviews, some confessed that this moment shifted their understanding of the conflict more than anything else. The propaganda that had painted the Allies as barbaric conquerors dissolved in the reality of clean bandages, warm blankets, and a medic's steady hand. For them, the United States was no longer just an abstract enemy. It became a place where mercy had triumphed in the very heart of war. Meanwhile, in the American camps and hospitals that expanded across France, the policy of treating enemy wounded first when necessary continued. It was not without resistance. Some commanders bristled at the idea, fearing that their men's morale would erode if they saw Germans receiving equal or greater care. Yet the medics, supported by the ethical foundations of the Geneva Convention, carried on. They insisted that the act of healing was above politics, that war could not strip them of the obligation to see even their enemies as human beings. For some soldiers, this was a source of pride. They saw in their medics a reflection of the values they believed they were fighting for. For others, it remained a bitter pill, one that time and perspective would soften only after the war had ended. The German doctors who had stood witness to it all carried their astonishment into captivity, where they often became quiet advocates for treating prisoners humanely. In POW camps across England and the United States, they repeated the stories of what they had seen in Normandy, sometimes to skeptical ears, sometimes to men who listened in silence, wrestling with their own memories of cruelty committed in the East. In this way, the ripple of that first moment, the sight of American medics prioritizing German lives, spread further than the boundaries of the field hospital. It was a seed of change, small but potent, that challenged hardened beliefs about mercy, justice, and strength. Looking back now from the distance of decades, the power of that act is clear. The image of American medics treating German soldiers first was not just a story of medical necessity. It was a moment when humanity refused to bow to hatred, when men chose to honor life even in the shadow of death. It did not end the war. It did not erase the bitterness or the atrocities, but it stood as a reminder that even amid the vast machinery of destruction, the individual choices of ordinary men, tired, frightened but resolute, could shine a light that pierced the darkness. For the German doctors, it was a revelation. For the American medics, it was a burden carried with honor. And for history, it was proof that compassion, even when offered to an enemy, can become one of the most enduring victories of all.